Welcome, historians. Today we're going to talk about the study of economics. This is a pretty quick overview of most of the terms and ideas that you will need to know throughout this chapter. However, also be sure to complete all of the other assigned readings and check the book out for yourself as well, as this is just kind of a brief overview. So, when we are talking about economics, let's first define what we mean. So an economy is any system of producing and distributing goods. This is kind of interesting because when you talk about economics generally, or when you hear about economics being discussed, you're usually talking about our economy, the economy of the United States or other similar Western industrialized nations that have fairly free market economies. There's plenty to study about market economies, but they're not the only type of economy. And we need to keep this in mind as we think throughout history, as economic activity has taken many different forms over the course of human history in different places. And the things that we think of as the basic economic terms today are really just the basic economic terms for talking about capitalist market economies. Right? So let's keep that in mind and jump right into it. So the fundamental problem in an economy, and the reason why they have to be studied in the first place, is the problem of scarcity. When there is not enough material, when there are not enough resources to go around to everybody who wants those resources, you have to have some sort of system by which these resources are created and distributed. However this system shakes out for you is the economy of your society. So we'll talk about some of the different types of economies as we move forward. But scarcity is going to remain the fundamental problem. And with the problem of scarcity comes the problem or the opportunity of choice. People have to make choices in an economy based around scarcity simply because you can't always get everything that you want. So, resources in the forms of goods and services, things, physical things that you can buy, or services that you can engage in, fill both people's wants and needs. So, needs are things that you need in order to survive as a human. You need food, you need shelter, you need clean drinking water. There are certain things that you just need to have. But more than that, there are a lot of things that you probably want to have. And these can go from very reasonable wants that are not technically necessary and therefore aren't needs, but are still pretty nice to have. If you live in a warm climate, you might not technically need, clothing, but it's probably still a pretty good idea to have some, right? And then there are wants that are more far removed from needs, and these are just the things that we like to have. But either way, people's wants are essentially limitless. If everybody could have everything that they wanted, people would likely have quite a lot of stuff indeed. Resources, though, are not unlimited. And so when you have limited resources for unlimited wants, you ultimately have to make some tough decisions about how those resources will be applied to all of those unfulfilled wants out there. And economics is kind of the study of how that happens. So in this system, people are going to have to make choices. So if you're a consumer, for instance, and you have a certain amount of purchasing power, you have a certain amount of money or whatever your economy uses, you don't have enough to get everything that you might want, and so you need to make choices. These are called trade-offs, or you might refer to it more technically as the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is what you could have done with the money you're paying for something or the time that you're using for something that you're not, right? So the trade-off of buying an expensive ticket to go to a concert is that you might not then have the funding to go out to dinner with your friends, right? So you have to make a choice if you have limited resources. In this case, the limited resource is either money or time, whatever's stopping you from doing both of those things, right? So every choice that you make in economics has an opportunity cost associated with it. It has a trade-off. So things aren't seen just in the vacuum of, is this a good resource or not? You also have to think about the trade-off or opportunity cost of what else could have happened, right? If you're trying to maximize your happiness, you might choose, whatever thing makes you happiest. If you're trying to maximize your profit so that you can invest further, you might make a different choice, right? You also might make different choices if you're thinking about your short-term versus your long-term needs or wants. But either way, because of scarcity, everybody is always making choices in an economy. One way of framing these choices on the large scale is by trying to apply certain laws of behavior to economics. So the most fundamental ones that we'll talk about in our unit are simply supply and demand. So usually this is referred to as like the law of supply and demand, but really they're separate. A law of supply and a law of demand, and the way they interact governs most of the basic market functions in our economy. So the law of supply basically states that businesses will produce, that is to say, they'll supply more of a product the higher the price of that product goes, right? So if people are willing to buy something for a lot of money, if I'm producing shoes and the shoes I'm making are quite nice and people are willing to pay a lot of money for these very high quality shoes, I'm going to try to make as many of these shoes as possible. Since they're selling at a high price, the more of them I sell, the more money I will make. On the other hand, consumers who would like to save money, right, because they want to make less of a trade-off if possible, will buy more of something at a lower price. So the lower I make the price of my shoes, the more people will be willing to buy those shoes. And the idea is that the supply and the demand will meet at a certain point, and we'll call this the sort of natural market price, right? There's a certain price where if I make them any more expensive, I'll end up making less money because people won't buy them anymore, right? And there's a certain price at which if I make them any less expensive, well, then I'm not making any money, so I won't produce them if I can't sell them for at least that certain equilibrium price. Now, obviously, there's a lot of ways that this can get complicated. We all know that there are certain things that some people are attracted to buying simply because they have a high price, right? So the normal consumer behavior is you want to buy at a low price. But there are certain types of products, or at least certain types of consumers, that will sometimes actively want to buy something more at a higher price. So to go back to shoes, if I make my shoes in, a limited collector's edition, there's a chance that I can convince people by the inherent scarcity in making it limited that they should acquire these shoes because they're rare or because people will think they're awfully cool to have such a expensive shoe, right? So of course there are exceptions. Likewise, if I make a product too cheap, perhaps people will be suspicious that it's not the best quality, and so they might buy something that's slightly more expensive just so that they don't have the cheapest version. These are exceptions to the general rule. The general rule is that businesses want prices to be high as long as they're selling well, and consumers want prices to be low as long as the quality of the product is acceptable, right? So obviously a lot of exceptions, but that's the basic idea. This points to the idea that in order for the economy to function well, we need incentives, right? We need reasons why people are going to engage in these complicated market practices. And the most obvious one is profit. So profit for a business is the amount of money you have left over after you sell your products and you pay for all of the production costs, right? So if I'm making shoes, once again, I need to pay for all my materials. I need to pay for the rubber for the soles and the leather or the material for the uppers and whatever I'm making the laces out of. I need to pay people to help me manufacture the shoes, presumably. So I have a lot of costs, and then I sell my shoes for what seems like a good bit of money, but I've got to pay off those costs first. If I manage to do that and I still have money left over, then that is my profit. I can go ahead and keep that, or I can reinvest it in the company to create a bigger factory or to hire more designers or whatever it is I think I need to do to grow the company. Or, I could just be satisfied making that amount of profit, but that's not the usual case with businesses, right? because the incentive is to get more profit so that you can grow your business even larger, right? So this profit incentive means that companies are not willing to produce items, below the cost where they're going to be making this basic profit. This way, sellers have an incentive to bring goods to market, and people have an incentive to shop around to make sure that they're getting the best deals on the goods and services that they need or want to acquire. To get into it in a little more detail, since we're talking about production, let's talk about the factors of production quickly. So the factors of production are essentially the things that go into making a product, making goods and services. They all come from a combination of these four things. The first, perhaps the most obvious, is natural resources. These are things that were already a part of the earth when we noticed that they were useful, right? So things like oil and coal and wood and rock and water, these are all natural resources. They're essential for making products, depending on what the products are. If you're making wooden chairs, you need obviously a certain amount of wood. If you're creating electricity in slightly before modern types of electricity generation, you definitely needed coal, or you needed natural gas, or you needed oil. Natural resources are the things that essentially the earth supplies and that humans have used for all of human history to create new things. Capital, on the other hand, are, you might call them unnatural resources. So they're resources, they're things that you use to create products, but they themselves are made by people. They're synthetic. So something like a tool is considered a piece of capital. It's something you use to make your product. It's not the product itself, unless you're a tool company. However, it's not the thing you're actually selling, right? So a natural resource might be the metal that I make my hammer out of, and then a hammer or a more complicated machine especially is an example of capital. These are the things that you need in order to be certainly a modern business, but every, even ancient business, had some version of capital that you need. For my shoe factory, I need the natural resources of the rubber and the canvas or leather or whatever, but I also need capital investment. I need either the machines that you use to sew shoes, or I at least need the money that you need to, pay people to build those machines for me, right? So the complicated shoe making machine is an example of capital. It's a tool which is applied to the natural resources in order to make them a product, right? So you need those two things. But who's the person that's doing that applying, right? Who knows how to apply tools to natural resources in order to create products? That's where labor comes in. So labor is the work that people apply to capital and natural resources in order to increase their value or usefulness for the market, right? A pile of rubber and other, resources and a pile of shoemaking tools don't do me any good as an investor or business owner or whatever, unless I have somebody who's able to do the labor to apply those tools to those resources to make a product, right? And since I had to pay for the capital, right, I had to save up the capital, and I had to acquire the natural resources, then I hope that by applying the labor to these two things, I make it more valuable than these two piles were on their own, right? So my pile of rubber is worth a certain amount, and my pile of tools are worth a certain amount, and hopefully if I apply the labor through the tools to the resources to make both of these piles into one giant pile of shoes, hopefully that is a more valuable end product for me than those inputs were, right? So the goal with labor is to, apply labor, expertise, know-how, or just physical labor to capital and natural resources in order to make them more valuable, right? So labor is absolutely essential for that, right? So a natural resource might be, something like meat, right? So if you're going to run a hamburger restaurant, you need a natural resource. So I don't know, maybe meat's not a natural resource because it's farm raised and all of that, but let's say you hunted for it. So you've got a natural resource like some ground meat. You have a capital investment like a big grill or fry station. But without the labor of somebody who's like flipping that burger and cooking it and making sure it's good and assembling it and giving it to a customer and handling that customer interaction, right? It's labor that makes all of that actually valuable, right? That transforms it into something we need for the market. The fourth factor of production, according to textbook is entrepreneurs or entrepreneurialness. Entrepreneurs, according to the definition, are people who use their own labor and capital, along with assuming the risk of the business and putting in the work to run the business, in order to help all of these things go together into being a viable business, right? So you've probably heard a lot about entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are people who will often start, many different business ventures, and their expertise is really how do we take these factors of production and really optimize them? Who's going to be, the person to assume the risk of this big enterprise, right? Because if it turns out that my pile of rubber and my pile of shoemaking tools is not more valuable once I use labor to convert it to shoes, well, then what has the point of all of this been, right? And if I fail at that, then the business fails and we've had a big loss. That's the risk I assume by creating the business, right? So we call a person of this willingness, or the existence of people with this willingness and capability, entrepreneurs, and we call this the fourth factor of production. So your textbook lists it this way, and it's not uncommon to find this in economic textbooks, especially more modern ones. However, there is some controversy over whether or not entrepreneurs should be included in this. People who are pro-entrepreneurs being a factor of production will say that the entrepreneur assumes a unique position of being sort of the focal point of labor and capital and taking on this risk themselves, and that is what allows businesses to flourish. People who are against entrepreneurs being considered a factor of production will probably just think entrepreneurs are valuable and good and all of that, but simply that's just a type of labor, right? You're just describing a certain type of labor being an entrepreneur, right? Entrepreneurs invest capital and they do labor, but capital and labor are things that are already on the list. So what does an entrepreneur bring to the table that isn't already described in our list? So I'm probably of the second view there, very valuable entrepreneurship, obviously, but it seems like a combination of labor and capital rather than its own separate thing. However, we're going to go with entrepreneurs being the fourth factor of production officially, because there's something to that, and also just to be in line with our other readings on that. We'll think of it that way. But just know that with all of these terms, really, there's some debate amongst historians and economists and anthropologists. So this leads us to the idea that once you have all of these factors of production, you get some goods and services being produced, people are buying them, that you've now created an economy of sorts, right? Again, an economy is any system of buying and any system of producing and distributing goods. But now we have more economic activity going. So we should talk about the types of economies that there are overall. Now, the realistic answer to the question, how many types of economies are there, the real answer is however many economies there are, because no single economy is exactly like another economy. Different countries have different systems, but it's not like every country necessarily has its own system, because there's obviously things like global trade. There's sub-economies, so a city will have an economy even within the economy of a state, even within the economy of a nation, even within the global economy. But then even within that city's economy, you might have an economy of certain neighborhoods. Families have their own economy. They obviously produce goods and services for each other, but money's rarely changing hands within an actual family unit. So many different economies are going on at the same time. So let's just describe sort of the major ones that apply to the nation, that apply to on the country level, or at least on the large group level, right? So the first is a traditional economy. Now, this is not any one set economy. This just means that economics functions how they always traditionally have in that area. And we'll get into this more once we talk about money and trade and how things change over time. But the idea is that things have been happening a certain way since the dawn of human history. While many economies have transitioned to the other types we'll talk about, in many places in the world, economic activity takes a more traditional form, right? So this varies in different areas. It might just be, barter in some areas, trading good directly for other goods without the use of money. Or you might have a traditional economy where in something like instead of paying taxes, you participate in a government labor project, like to help build a road or something like that. There's all sorts of traditional economies out there, but really, when we say traditional economy today, we simply mean an economy that doesn't use a lot of the modern things that we have to ease economic transactions today, such as currency or money. The second type that we'll talk about is a command economy. So a command economy is basically an economy where the government decides what will be produced, who will produce it, at what price it will be sold. Basically, the government makes all of these economic decisions. So there's a certain amount of scarcity, but the government just looks at the total amount of resources and the total amount of wants and needs, tries to get a hold on that, and then tries to match it up as well as possible, right? So a command economy is certainly not common in the world today in terms of a pure command economy, because the global economy is really just too complicated for that anyway. There are a few examples, but they tend to be smaller countries. However, that doesn't mean that economies don't have command elements, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Historically, there's plenty of examples of command economies. Probably the most significant one in even semi-modern history is during the reign of the Soviet Union, during their period of more centralized planning. They would basically have a state economics unit, and they would analyze all of the natural resources available to the Soviet Union. How much oil do we have? How much coal do we have? How much steel can we make? And then they would look at all of the different needs and wants of the Soviet Union. So they would say, okay, we need to feed people, and people eat about this much per day. We also need a space program, so we'll need this much steel. We also need to create cars, so we'll need this much gasoline, right? And then they would basically match those up. They would see, all right, what are the most important needs and wants to address? Let's use those according to the natural resources and capital that we have, and we'll take it from there. So without going into the history of any particular economy, there's some things that worked really well there. There's some things that didn't work really well. But whenever you have a command economy, then people need to really understand how to make those choices, right? So it can be very complicated very quickly. And sometimes, people just aren't good at doing incredibly complicated social systems. The next type of economy we'll talk about is a market economy, which is fundamentally the opposite of a command economy. In a market economy, the government makes very few, if any, of these economic decisions. It certainly doesn't decide what businesses should produce and what price it should be sold for. They might have just some basic rules, but in a market economy, and generally, you want the government to be involved as little as possible. And the reason for this is the belief that through competition, the market will become more and more efficient on its own, right? So because businesses have the profit incentive, right, they have an incentive to try to create products for as cheaply as possible so that people will want to buy their products, and they'll be able to, make the most money off of that. And by all of these businesses competing with each other, that will drive costs down. It will increase efficiency because everybody's always trying to outdo everybody else in terms of their profit incentives. And ideally, this should work out for consumers because businesses are all competing to have the best products available most cheaply. And it should work out for businesses as well because they have the most freedom in order to, try to meet the economic demands that they're interested in trying to meet. So a market economy is really not in the hands of the government except for some general types of regulation, like, for example, keeping the currency stable, that we're all going to use dollars, but otherwise, fewer rules, the better, right? So a market economy has that level of economic freedom where this competition creates a efficiency based on everybody wanting to squeeze as much profit out of the transactions as possible. And this goes for the consumers as well, right? The consumers saving money is essentially profit to them, so consumers are shopping for the best deal and businesses are trying to create the best products. And the idea is that if the government kind of just steps back, then the law of supply and demand will work all of this out. So market economies are known for high efficiency, especially just in terms of production and in terms of bringing new and novel products to market. The final type of economy that we'll talk about is called a mixed economy, and that is any economy that uses aspects of these other types of economic systems. So realistically, every modern economy is a mixed economy. There's no pure market economy really as the national economy of any country because, you do need certain regulations. You do need to make sure that people are safe. You need to regulate pollution and things like that. Likely, in order to protect the overall economic well-being of the country, you would probably want some basic guidelines that govern the market. Likewise, there are just some things that the market's not going to provide, and we call these public goods. So public goods are any goods that the free market is not likely to provide for a number of reasons that we won't go into in too much detail right now, but essentially they would never be profitable to provide at the level that we need them provided. So the most basic example is probably something like, firefighting service, right? We all acknowledge that we need firefighters. We need to be able to make sure that we don't suddenly, have a fire in a city that's burning down half the city and there's nobody to stop it. But at the same time, private fire companies would be pretty tricky, right? You buy a subscription to a fire company, and that means that if your house catches on fire, they'll come and they'll put it out, right? I guess that's fine. It would be pretty tragic when somebody who didn't have a subscription, their house catches on fire and no fire department comes to help them. But if you were a true free market person, maybe you would say, okay, well, that's their choice. They chose something else instead of the trade-off of paying for fire coverage. But obviously, we just might not want that as a society. We would want people's houses not to burn down, even if they can't afford fire protection. But B, when somebody's house is on fire, all of the neighbors' houses are in danger, right? So one person's decision not to buy fire coverage would negatively impact everybody else around them, right? So we wouldn't want a situation where we didn't just put out the fires to keep everybody safe. So that's why instead of private companies doing it, because they wouldn't be able to really wring any profit out of that system, so instead the government just provides it. So the government charges taxes to everybody, and in turn, everybody has fire protection. Think of the military the same way, right? If you had a military where you didn't have to pay military defense taxes and then the army just wouldn't protect you, that's not really realistic, right? If half of a city pays and half of a city doesn't pay, there's no way that the military can protect only half of a city from some sort of foreign attack or invasion or whatever the military is doing, right? So it's kind of all or nothing on a public good. So instead, everybody pays taxes that go into the military, and in turn the military protects everybody at the national level, right? So that's a public good. So realistically, a certain number of public goods need to exist, and you could have a debate over exactly what should be a public good. So police protection is usually a public good, but obviously private security services exist also. You would say often in a lot of places that healthcare is a public good, where in some market economies it's less of a public good and there's more private insurance and private doctors, whereas in some countries more of that is provided by the government. So mixed economies make decisions about what should be a public good, so essentially what should be a part of the command economy in a certain way, and what should be left to the market to decide. So the United States is technically a mixed economy, but leans very heavily towards a market economy. There are fewer things that are public goods, and more things that are market goods compared to some other countries, right? But still a mixed economy, and essentially every advanced country has a mixed economy right now in some ways, because each of these economic systems have some benefits, and you want to capture each of the benefits. So that leads us to the idea of money itself, which we haven't really talked about yet. We've talked a lot about trade and buying and selling, but we should actually talk about money. So what is money? Money is essentially three things. It is a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Now, this sounds complicated, but it's already the basic things that money does. We're just talking about them a little bit differently. So a medium of exchange goes back to the idea of money replacing the barter system, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But essentially, money is a medium of exchange. That means things are exchanged through the medium or through the idea or value of money, right? So if I have shoes and somebody else has cups, it would be hard to just trade, right? Because I will not likely need shoes at the exact same time that somebody else needs cups, and so it wouldn't make sense to just trade. Or it might be difficult to determine how many shoes equals a cup or anything like that. With money, we get rid of this problem. So this problem is called the double coincidence of wants. In order for barter to work, I need to want to give something at the same time somebody else wants to get something and give something else that I happen to want to get. The odds of that happening seem pretty low. However, if we know that this thing called money will still have a stable value later on, well, then I'll sell my shoes for money, even though I don't need cups right now, because then later on I can then pay that money for a cup when I do need it, or for something else when I do need it, right? So money essentially makes trade a lot easier by being like an in-between step. And that's what medium of exchange means. It also means a store of value. Ideally, money will be worth something similar in the future to what it is worth now. Obviously, there's things like inflation, but in general, money should be a stable store of value. If I have $5, that $5 should still be worth $5 a bit later on. That's true of money that's in the form of things like gold as well, because it's very stable. But think, if you're trying to have your medium of exchange be something like fish, like you're in a fishing community, and so people have fish, and so you want to trade fish back and forth, it's not really a store of value, because if I have $5 worth of fish, in a few weeks, it's not going to be worth anything anymore because the fish is going to go bad, right? So it's a store of value. It's someplace where you can essentially have a certain value and hold on to it and know that it will still be worth that same value later on. And finally, a unit of account, right? And this is kind of a bookkeeping metric, but this ends up being incredibly important in history, and we'll actually come to this a lot. So a unit of account just means it's a way of us keeping track, right? If one person has 20 cows and another person has 1,000 shoes, you can't have bank accounts just being like, oh, how much value does this person have? Oh, they have 1,000 shoes of value, and this person has 20 cows of value. There's no way to compare that, right? There's no way to know the equivalencies. So if we use money instead as a unit of account, like we know shoes are worth this amount, and so ultimately this is the amount that we add up the value to, having money be a common unit of account is very useful, right? Money overall is distinct from wealth, which is sometimes confusing. Wealth means the value of all of somebody's possessions, not just the money that they have, right? So one's wealth includes if you own a house or if you own a car, or basically if you total up the value of all your possessions, that's your wealth. You might not easily be able to trade those for money, right? You might not be able to sell that house quickly or, ever, depending on the market. So it's not really an equivalent of money, but it does add to your wealth overall. But speaking of money and trade, so the last thing we'll talk about is just how we came to this system of money. So we're going to look at this in a lot more detail in another reading that we'll go into. And again, this is something that historians and anthropologists, it's not as if these are all set in stone. These are terms that people continue to actively debate over as more historical knowledge and analysis is gained, right? But let's do the brief version now, right? So essentially, money's been around for quite a while, but we know very clearly that it wasn't around for all of human history. And so economists have thought, well, how did money develop? What problem was it trying to solve? And it's the problem that I alluded to earlier, right? So when we begin an economy at the really beginning stage, people are kind of fending for themselves. Everything that you need is something that you have to make for yourself. You have to farm. You have to manufacture stuff. But once people realize, well, sometimes people have a comparative advantage, right? Sometimes natural resources make it so some people have easier access to something than other people, right? So if I live near the ocean and I have easy access to fish, for me, fish are not very valuable at all. But somebody who lives inland and they're near a forest, they have a lot of access to wood. They might really value fish and have very little value for wood, whereas I might not value fish very much at all, but I would trade a lot of fish for some wood, right? Because that way we both can have the things that we need. So I have a comparative advantage in producing fish because I'm near the water. They have a comparative advantage in producing wood because they're near the forest. So instead of, them trying to harvest food by hunting and me trying to build structures out of rocks or whatever, instead, it's better for us to just focus on the thing we have an advantage in and then trade with each other, right? So I'm just going to focus all my time on fish, and they're going to focus all their time on lumber, and then we'll just trade. We'll do what we're best at, and then we'll use that product to get the other stuff that we need. This is called a division of labor, or a specialization economy. Instead of everybody working subsistence for themselves and their family, instead people try to specialize in the thing that they happen to either be best at or that they have an advantage in just due to natural resource allocation, and then trade with each other. However, when we have all of this trade, we introduce that double coincidence of wants we talked about, right? I can produce all the fish that I want, but if the person near the forest doesn't need any fish right now because, maybe they have a farm or maybe they hunted some deer, then my fish suddenly aren't going to do me any good. I spent so much time specializing in producing fish, but I can't do anything with the fish, and the fish is not a good store of value, so now I'm kind of stuck, right? So that's where money comes in. Money, being a medium of exchange, eliminates the double coincidence of wants, right? I might not, need any wood right now, so I don't want to trade my fish for it or anything like that. But however, if I trade it for money, if I trade it for a currency that I know will be stable, then I know that, okay, even though I don't need anything right now, I can hold on to this and then I can use it to trade for the thing that I want later on, right? So essentially, it's this like medium step that creates a flexible delay in trade that allows much more fluid and dynamic trading opportunity, right? So the first system we'll call barter, right? When I'm trading fish directly for lumber, I'm trying to figure out how many fish equals how much lumber, and then we'll trade those two things directly. That's called a barter system, and it's complicated because of this double coincidence of wants, right? So we introduce money to get rid of that problem, to make it so people can trade everything directly for money, and then they can use that money to buy whatever else they need. And this ultimately becomes the more efficient system, right? So this is kind of just a general overview of all the terms that we're going to talk about in economics. We'll definitely jump into all of them in a little bit more detail, but I hope this has been kind of a helpful overview to go along with your reading, and I'll see you in class.